In this video, we are talking about industry analysis. Specifically, we are going to use the Porter Five Forces model to assess the profit potential of an industry. So first, what is an industry? An industry is a group of companies that offer products or services that are close substitutes for each other. So these products or services satisfy the same basic customer need. You can subdivide industries into even smaller groups, oftentimes strategic clusters or strategic groups. For example, if we're thinking about airlines, you might think about ultra low-cost carriers like Frontier Airlines in a different strategic group compared to, say, traditional carriers in the US market like Delta or American Airlines. That doesn't mean that they're in different industries. They're just maybe within different strategic subsets within the same industry because they're all still meeting the same basic customer need. The second piece you need to define an industry is geography. So you have the product or service that you're offering, and then second, you need to specify where you're offering it. It might be a global scale of competition, it might be national, or it might be local. So for example, if you're talking about an industry and the customer need that industry meets is getting dinner tonight in Fairbanks, Alaska, we're looking at restaurants in Fairbanks, Alaska. A restaurant in Seattle, Washington probably wouldn't even be considered in the same industry. Why does industry matter? So profitability across companies varies a lot. And a big chunk of that variation is explained simply by industry level factors that managers of a specific company have very little control over. So this list here, this chart shows average profit margins by a number of different industries. And this is just the top of the list, so it doesn't show you the full levels of variation here. But you can see that if you're operating a regional bank, it's going to look a little bit different than if you operate in the shipbuilding and marine industry. So we call those industry effects. We'll talk a little bit more about the origin of those industry effects, and academics estimate that they account for approximately 20% of the variation in profitability between businesses. Firm level effects, so things that managers or decision makers at a business can control, account for about 55% of the variation in profitability levels. Finally, there's this unexplained bucket that counts for about a quarter of all variability in profitability across different businesses, and that's explained by business cycle effects, so variation in the economy, and other unanticipated or unexplained things, change in the weather, for example, basically anything that's not captured in these other two big buckets. So when I talk about industry effects, I'm talking about the industry structure. So we're talking about the number of competitors in an industry, whether or not businesses competing in the industry are able to set prices, whether products or services are differentiated from one another or distinguished enough that customers don't view them as perfectly interchangeable. So all those factors feed into what we describe as the industry structure. So this chart shows you the range from perfect competition to monopoly. In the US, in reality, we're oftentimes looking at structures that look closer to monopolistic competition or oligopoly, some that are approaching perfect competition, but there aren't a lot of good examples of truly perfect competition. On the flip side, there are very few monopolies, except if you were to think of maybe a utility or service where there's only one provider in an area. And generally, because monopolies are frowned upon, monopolies tend to be heavily regulated in the US, so they're not able to just charge whatever price their heart desires. Michael Porter had a background in industry economics. He understood these differences between different industry structures, but he thought this model failed to capture the role of other key actors besides for just the existing competitors in an industry. So suppliers, customers, new entrants, and substitute products. He added these different elements to consider, and so it rounded out that model and now made 5 things instead of just one thing, which is the existing industry structure to consider when you're thinking about the profitability of an industry. Michael Porter's model has been widely adopted in both the professional and academic world, although there's not a lot of empirical research to back it up. It's still a very helpful model in terms of structuring your thinking about an industry. So this is what the 5 forces model actually looks like. Again, those 5 buckets are new entrants, buyers, suppliers, substitute products, and existing rivalry. I'm not going to go through this or every element of this model, but I'm going to highlight a couple elements to consider. So let's start with new entrants. The threat of new entrants is low when barriers to entry are high. Those two work inversely to one another. So what are some barriers to entry? One common one is capital costs or startup costs. So I'll give you the example of Boeing. They produce commercial aircraft. The commercial aircraft industry essentially has 2 competitors, Boeing and Airbus. And part of that is because it is so expensive to develop and manufacture aircraft. Other examples of barrier to entry might include restrictive government regulation or licensing requirements, economies of scale, product differentiation, or brand loyalty. Let's talk about bargaining power of buyers. When we're considering buyers, we look primarily at the concentration of the buyer's industry, as well as price sensitivity of buyers, and finally switching costs. So Walmart, if you sell to Walmart, if Walmart is your buyer, then it's safe to say that the bargaining power of buyers is usually pretty high. If your buyer's industry is concentrated, that means there are very few buyers and they are fairly large and account for quite a bit of your sales, we say that industry is concentrated. If instead you sell directly to consumers, you sell to individuals, so you sell to many small buyers, and that would be an example of an industry that lacks concentration or a buyer that lacks concentration. Price sensitivity also affects the buyer or the bargaining power of buyers. If your buyers are very price sensitive, it limits your ability to increase your prices. Finally, switching costs. Software is a great example of this. If an end user has to learn an entire new suite of software and it takes many hours of their day, that represents a large switching cost, which makes them unlikely to switch from their existing software supplier, for example. So if your buyer faces large switching costs, that might lower their bargaining power because they are less likely to leave you as a buyer. The threat of substitute products. So I mentioned that when we talk about an industry, it's just a group of companies that are close substitutes for one another. Anything that doesn't fall in that immediate bucket of close substitutes still might meet the same customer need, just not as well. Those less perfect substitutes we put in this category of the threat of substitute products. So for example, Uber might be a substitute for taxis. Looking at the bargaining power of suppliers, we do a similar analysis that we did when we looked at the buyer industry. And sometimes students get a little confused about the difference between suppliers and the existing rivalry or the industry we're actually analyzing. But suppliers are usually a distinct industry somewhere up the value chain that produce inputs to your product or service. So for example, if you produce computer hardware, you might have to buy microprocessors or chips from a company like Intel. And I use the example of Intel in part because they did an excellent job branding themselves and becoming an input that went into hardware and wasn't really sold directly to end users. But now end users knew to ask, is the processor in here, is it Intel? And that gave them more power and increased the bargaining power of suppliers relative to computer hardware producers. So I didn't talk too much about the rivalry amongst existing competitors because we did talk a little bit about Industry structure. So all these factors go into that rivalry amongst existing competitors. So industry concentration. Also, how easy is it to get in and exit the market? So exit costs. Have existing competitors made strategic commitments? Have they made big investments recently? It may make them less likely to exit a market and may make them more fierce competitors, and increase the rivalry amongst existing competitors. Brand loyalty and product differentiation also plays into account here. Are we talking about commodity products that are largely interchangeable, or are these products or services that customers know to ask for by brand name? So I wanted to give you a quick example of an industry, consumer staples retail. So staples are the things you need to have, not the things you want to have. Basic foodstuffs, things like that. So when we talk about consumer staples retail in the US, the competitors that you can see on this chart, the largest ones are Walmart, Costco, Target. Also put into this bucket are Dollar General and Dollar Tree. So if we were to consider the 5 forces for this industry, we'd probably say threat of new entrants, fairly low, because it would be pretty expensive to achieve the same scale or a similar scale to compete with big box stores like Walmart or Target. They have both a very extensive supply network as well as a lot of real estate in the US, and it would be hard to get a foothold in that industry. Bargaining powers of buyers, low. So these retailers sell ultimately to individual buyers, so it's a low concentration when you consider their buyers, although price sensitivity may be a factor. Substitute products, moderate. I don't need to go shop at a Walmart. I can go shop at a grocery store. I can go shop at a department store, and I can certainly shop online. So for all those reasons, there are quite a few substitutes that may not be direct competitors in this category because they do things a little bit differently or they meet customer needs a little bit differently, but they can meet customer needs fairly well. Bargaining power of suppliers, fairly low. Again, consider these big box stores like Walmart and Target. Are sourcing goods from all sorts of different suppliers, and many of them are interchangeable. Finally, the threat of existing competitors or the rivalry amongst existing competitors is moderate to high in this industry. So we consider industry concentration, the size and number of competitors. There are only a few competitors and they're fairly large in this industry. So that would point to less rivalry. That being said, there isn't a lot of product differentiation here. You may have noticed stores like Target have developed their own product lines in store. So not just private label, but a variety of other clothing lines and things like that to try and attract customers and create a different customer experience than you might have in, say, a Walmart. But ultimately, at the end of the day, for most of the goods that they sell, these are largely interchangeable between these stores, which leads to higher rivalry amongst these existing competitors. So hopefully this was a helpful walkthrough of a 5 forces model and you're able to apply it in your own work.